Welcome to the Nemeth Report podcast. Hello, I'm Dr. Tammy Nemeth, historian and independent researcher, and I will be your host. Today's podcast episode will explore the issue of hydrocarbons, from miracle to menace. We, humanity, are living in a time of unprecedented prosperity. Every indicator of human well-being has improved and continues to improve since the end of World War II and in the past 20 years in particular. Fewer people in the world are starving, more infants are surviving childbirth and childhood, people are living longer, diseases are in decline, extreme poverty is below 10% of the world's population. We produce 25% more food than we consume. Less land is being used for meat production. We have more forests. Our air and water quality have improved. More people are being educated globally. Amazingly, we can flip a switch and we can light up our homes on demand. We can turn a dial or press a button to control the temperature in our homes on demand. We have time-saving appliances in our homes like fridges and stoves and washing machines. We can get into a vehicle and travel quickly from one place to another whenever we need or want to. We can pop into a service station and refuel quickly and continue on our way. We can go to our local grocery store and have plentiful, nutritious, and fresh food all year round, even in winter. Behind the scenes, an efficient system of pumps, wires, pipelines, roads, trucks, airplanes, factories, and farms produce and transport all of these things without us even realizing it. Never has life been so good for so many in the history of the world. That might sound effusive and hyperbolic, but it's true. And the fundamental driver of these incredible improvements to human living and well-being is the miracle of reliable, affordable energy in the form of hydrocarbons, oil, natural gas, and coal, and made possible through our capitalist economic system. This energy and economic system is one of comparative efficiency and reliability in energy production, trade, resource use, environmental spatial footprint, material, and longevity. Yet, if you were to ask your neighbors if they thought the world has been improving, chances are the answer would be no. If you were to ask your neighbor if they thought capitalism was a good system and that it was a good way to ensure energy, goods, and services arrived efficiently, reliably, and affordably, while at the same time helping preserve and manage the environment, they would probably express doubts. There is a disconnect between what people see as the driver of their prosperity and the hydrocarbons and economic system that makes it possible. People are being led to believe that humanity and the environment is worse off, and that if we continue living the way we do and using any hydrocarbons at all, the global environment and humanity with it will be destroyed in the very near future. Hydrocarbons have gone from being considered a miracle for the development and progress of humanity to a menace of the planet's future. People in North America and other developed regions are being made to feel guilty for having a free and prosperous way of life, and that in order to save the planet, we must change the way we live. The solution being offered in Canada and other developed countries is a forced, rapid energy transition and a reimagining of our economic system to a net zero, corporatist, technocratic, circular economy. Oil, natural gas, and coal are to be rapidly phased out and forbidden from being used at all. This is the premise of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty and the Keep It in the Ground movement. The forced energy transition means reducing global human carbon dioxide emissions to zero. Publicly promising it will be just a matter of replacing one form of energy with another, and replacing one form of automobile with another. But privately, and in certain circles, the reality being proposed through regulation and legislation is a fundamental shift in our very way of living and economic system through degrowth. Let me say that again, degrowth. Pundits and news articles that we must embrace a transition to net zero. However, this controlled narrative does not convey the impossible struggle to get to their vision of a net zero world, nor the sudden and significant drop in our living standard that is required to get to zero emissions and live within a degrowth circular economy. These changes are not benign, nor are they altruistic. They serve to undermine and destroy our modern way of life and the hydrocarbons at their heart. It is not just rule changes, it's a complete system change. Even though our system based on hydrocarbons is not only the lives of more people in the world than ever in history, but it has improved the care of our environment and planet through freer trade, reliable and affordable energy, and capitalism. This is a system worth keeping and fighting for. Today I'll be speaking with David Yager, oil service executive, energy policy analyst, author, and writer, on this shift of our appreciation and understanding of hydrocarbons, from miracle to menace, as described in his appropriately titled book of the same name, and how this fits in with the proposed net zero transition. Before we begin, let me introduce Mr. Yager. Since 1970, David Yager has worked in multiple oil service segments and was a founder, senior officer, and director of 3 successful TSX-listed oil service companies. He has also served as National Leader Oil Field Services for MNP LLP, a leading Canadian tax accounting and consulting provider. He is currently president and CEO of Winterhawk Well Abandonment Limited, which is commercializing a well-bore methane emission technology. Through Yager Management Limited, he consults as an executive finance and management advisor to oil service companies, as well as presenting upstream oil and gas industry and other organizations. He was chairman of the Petroleum Services Association of Canada in 2009. Yager has been active in business journalism and energy policy analysis since 1979. He has authored numerous energy policy position papers for oil service trade associations. He is a regular commentator about the industry in newspapers, magazines, TV, and radio. David Yager's book, From Miracle to Menace, Alberta, A Carbon Story, was released in 2019 and is available on Amazon. Thank you for joining me today, David.
Good. Hello.
Hi. First, I wanted to say how much I enjoyed your book. And as a historian, I quite appreciated the inclusion of the various historical details and context you included. Quite often, appropriate historical context is missing from writings on energy issues, so yours was most welcome.
Well, thank you very much.
Can you perhaps begin by explaining?
Well, in my lifetime, it has been really a miracle to menace. Alberta there was really nothing here until 1947. My parents were families, ancestors of homesteaders in southern Manitoba. They immigrated from Europe to southern Manitoba when the railroad came in. So they were second generation. Their great grandparents came over, and then they were born here. Although they didn't, and then they moved to Alberta. There was nothing going on except drier climate. And then they struck oil at Leduc in 1947. My father, who was an accountant in a laundromat, got a job with an oil field service company. And I didn't realize it at the time, but at that point, I grew up in a land of remarkable opportunity. Because if you look at miracle to menace, if you look at Alberta and its geographical position in North America, it really is in the middle of nowhere. There's nothing for 1,000 kilometers to the west to the Pacific Ocean, nothing to the east until you get to central Canada, absolutely nothing to the north, and even to the south, it is the most underpopulated and economically the border states of North Dakota, Montana. There are less people in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, North Dakota, Montana combined than Alberta. So why are there 4.4 million people living in Alberta? And it was an absolute fossil fuel warehouse. It had astonishing quantities, globally significant quantities of coal, oil, and natural gas. And so that was the miracle. They discovered oil in 1947, discovered there was tons of it, built some pipelines into the United States, discovered natural gas, put it on stream. And what emerged was this landlocked, remarkable puddle of hydrocarbon-driven prosperity that became the envy of the nation. And so 4.4 million people live here now. There's nothing like it anywhere else in North America. And that was the miracle. And then we I guess it didn't, I wouldn't say woke up one day. It snuck up on us. But starting in 1988, I owned a oilfield trade magazine back then. And in 1988, I read my first article about Senate hearings in New York City, where James Hansen from NASA talked about global warming. And I, at that time, being a nosy reporter in one of my many careers as a writer, I went over to, at that time, the Canadian Petroleum Association, which is now CAP, and inquired. I said, what's going on with this global warming thing? At that time, in 1988, there was still the ravages of a global recession. So I started following the today's climate story. I guess that's 33 years ago, and watched it gain momentum until this century. And now, as we've gone from miracle, it really was an economic miracle, as he said in the introduction, of hydrocarbons and all the things he said about the incredible prosperity that low-cost energy has brought to the world. And now it's the end of life on Earth as we know it. So the catalyst for the book was all the advice Alberta was getting from the climate crowd that we ought to embrace renewables. They were blocking pipelines. It became a very political battle. That's well publicized. Barack Obama killed the Keystone XL pipeline the first time. His Democratic successor, did it again earlier this year. There was fierce political opposition to a pipeline to the West Coast. There was fierce political opposition to a pipeline to the East Coast. Of course, this is completely unprecedented. Where did this come from? I mean, everybody's got pipelines. Pipelines are everybody that owns a single family dwelling has probably got 4 pipelines coming in their backyard. One's water, one's sewage, one's natural gas. The other's the conduit for their electricity and cable TV. When did pipelines become the enemy of civilization? And I wanted to peel back the onion. So the purpose of the book was, and the reason I went into the history was when you tell Albertans that we must do something else, that we have to decarbonize, that the oil sands are a menace to life on Earth as we know it, that why don't we just get with the program and switch from low-cost, powerful hydrocarbons to renewable energy sources that are unexportable. That when you say you want to do this, what you really have to do to be completely successful, you're going to create probably 2 to 3 billion economic refugees in Alberta. Like instead of 4 point, we're going to go back to about the same population as our neighbors sustain, about 1 million people, which is the average population of Saskatchewan, Manitoba, North Dakota, and Montana. So as long as you know that success is going to create 3 million economic refugees, we can't all be whale watchers at the West Coast. If you know that, and you know that this is the most important part of the Canadian economy, and that this is the greatest single export we have, it's 10% of the Canadian GDP. If you know all that, then you're an informed voter, and bring it on. And then by all means, persecute us, continue to persecute us. But nobody knows that. So I wrote a book.
So why do you think that is? Why do you think that many Canadians assume the country can get by without its oil and gas industry? Where does this
Yeah,
assumption come
yeah.
from?
There's an astonishing level of economic delinquency. To really understand, the world's always had problems. I don't remember a world without problems. I'm a senior citizen. I grew up during the Cuban Missile Crisis. When I grew up during the Vietnam War, I've read about world hunger, world poverty, all the challenges of the developed world for all my life.
Yeah,
And
right.
then when I started on the book, I said, well, how did climate get to the top of the ladder? Of all the problems we face in the world, how did climate become the most important problem, certainly in the public narrative? And B, how did mankind ever get to the point where we thought we could change the weather? I mean, changing the weather used to be science fiction, right? Weather machines. Yeah, so, okay. But we woke up one day and said we can control the weather with enlightened public policy, the greatest enemy of life on Earth that we've ever faced. How did that come to be? So as I started researching the history, I talked about the early history, 1988, and I've watched it build over the years. But the next question was, how did this become the issue? And so I ended up having ecology, and that was an interesting exercise in the book. And of course, it goes back to Malthus and the early 30s in the 1700s, the early days of the coal-fired industrial revolution, that the population was growing more quickly than the ability of the world to feed itself. Then along came Silent Spring with Rachel Carlson, Rachel Carson, and DDT, which had saved an incredible number of lives by fighting malaria. Then along came the population bomb with Paul Ehrlich and the Club of Rome in 1972, and on and on and on. What it appears to me that fear sells, that there's some trigger in our DNA, in our mental DNA, and one of the great books written on the subject that has gone nowhere near the publicity it should is Peter Foster's classic "Why We Bite the Invisible Hand,"
Yes.
and that is along the roots of where we are today. And he did a lot of research on how that he thought it was sort of a default self-preservation, that fear is part of our DNA, fear of the future. And it would appear that this fear sells, fear is a trigger. We've made all sorts of world. None of them have come true, but every time someone comes up and if it's too good to be true, it must be impossible that things can't be as good as they are, as you so eloquently stated in your introduction. And so fear sells, like COVID right now. And so I guess that's how it was. Life is great. It shouldn't be great. We should suffer more. And here's, you've no right to do this. You've no right to be happy and wealthy.
That's a very interesting viewpoint. And I think that there's been a few other people, like you said, Greg Easterbrook, who said
Yes.
that society is undergoing a fundamental shift from material want to meaning want, with ever larger numbers of people feeling they lack significance in their lives. And so you described that very eloquently in how people are struggling, that there's been this sort of culture shift, and the climate movement has sort of tapped into that.
Yeah, it's further back than that. If you look back in politics, the whole progressive movement was created by fossil fuels. It used to be that people didn't really have time. It was the wealth that was created, the wealth and opportunity and an upper class that was created by the Industrial Revolution, where we created a layer, a strata of society that had more time to think about something other than the necessities of life, material needs, as the progress paradox so did a great job on that book 18 years ago. And so we had time to worry about something other than where's my next meal going to come from?
Right.
Am I going to make my rent and mortgage payment? So the progressive movement started in the 30s, along with wealth, and this is what we're seeing in climate today. This is seen as progressive, that what we're doing. So this was one of the perils, I guess, of all the progress that has been made, the progress paradox, if you will, going back to Easterbrook's book, is that there's all these times for people to think if it's too good to be true, there must be something, a flaw in this. So that's there.
Right.
So you throw in the fear factor. Well, let's get, you got nothing to worry about. I'll fix that. We're destroying. Let me give you something to keep you awake at night. So we're destroying mankind with the emissions from the prosperity that's given us time to worry about why we're so prosperous. It is very, very contradictory if you look at it. And so I finally understood that this was really the population bomb and Silent Spring and Club of Rome and etc., the end of growth, and all the theories going back to Malthus on steroids. We found the biggest one of all is that the very exhaling of processed oxygen to stay alive is destroying life. Incredible.
Exactly.
It's astonishing.
It's astonishing.
Yeah. It is astonishing. Yeah.
So it is the solution then to provide an alternative issue to worry about?
Well, I haven't come out. I think we have one now with the pandemic. COVID-19 seems to have come up with an issue that appears to be equally as devastating, a lot more immediate. It's not that you're going to, the seas are going to rise and flood Florida, as Al Gore said in his 2006 movie, anytime soon. That if the weather doesn't get you, the virus will.
Right.
And when these two issues, if climate passes and the virus is brought under control, you can be assured we'll find yet another one. There will be another. There will be another um, end of life issue that'll come along to preoccupy with. But I do think that the there's an element of absurdity of economic ingenuity in the whole climate discussion, and it is really a wealthy world phenomenon. And if you look, that's the other thing I had to look at was, okay, well, who is preoccupied with climate? So I peeled the world into two blocks. There's the OECD countries, the wealthy West, as I call it,
Right.
which is 1.3 billion people, which has electricity on the walls and a gas station on the corner, airports, everything you need, all the food you need in the supermarket. And we're the ones that are worried about this. And then there's the have-not, the 6.5 billion people that live in the rest of the world, who really don't give a whit about this. They still dealing with material needs of back to the basics. And you can see that in the recent events on the Earth Day climate summit that U.S. President Biden had. The countries that declined to increase their 2030 Paris emission reduction commitments, China, India, Russia, and Australia, account for 41% of the world emissions. I don't know why. I don't know why we don't talk about that. When I get the opportunity, in Canada we have the CBC, and I go on there. I sometimes wonder why, but they dust me off as in their pursuit of balance, and I try to, as we deal with Canada's attempts to do whatever we're going to do on the climate file, I try to bring up the reality of how we really ought to have China on the team. They don't even seem to want to talk about that. It's very insular. It's an astonishing thing to think that 1/2 of 1% affect the behavior of the other 99.5% of the world by thinking and saying the right thing. It's phenomenal.
Exactly. Yeah, it is phenomenal. And I find it interesting that with respect to China, a lot of the rhetoric and the news stories always, praises China for agreeing to do something in 2030. Maybe they'll stop growing their energy sector by 2030. Well, okay. What good does that do for the rest of the show continually for the next 9 years? Then what's the point of anyone else doing anything? Except I guess we're supposed to leave it all in the ground over here.
There's two elements to that. One is this goes back to the assurance thing, and I confess that in the epilogue of my book, that people there's three facts about politics that probably we should be more realistic about. One is that the people who run for public office know what they're doing. They're just the most ordinary people in the world that are elected to office one day. I ran for public office in 2012 for the Wild Rose Party in Alberta. There was 87 of us. 17 won, and 70 of us lost. And the 17 that won were greeted with they got a 400% overnight IQ increase, and they became experts on everything because they were elected to public office, right? So the so ordinary, they're pretty perfectly ordinary people are in politics, not. And the first thing we do is we assume that after you go from whatever you were the day before to elected office, the assumption of the public is you know what you're doing. The government must know what they're doing. And even there's no reason why they should. And the other aspect is once you are elected to public office and you're asked a difficult question, what can you do about the climate? You can't say, I have no idea. There's nothing I can do. Without China, there's nothing I can do. So it's a regrettable aspect of the public process. So I conceded in the book. People want, when they see a problem, they want assurances. They want to think once somebody has introduced a problem into their brain, they want someone to tell them it's not hopeless. I think one of the guys that the people that rise to the top, I use the example of Rudy Giuliani, whatever he is now. In 2001, he was running New York City, and the Twin Towers were attacked. He was on on the radio or television every day, telling people it would be okay. People wanted to hear that. Churchill did that during the Second World War, and that's another need, a human feedback loop that I don't think we should ignore. The other guy that did an outstanding in 2013 in Calgary, we had these horrible floods. Mayor Nenshi was very Nenshi was very good at that, saying it'll be okay. So that's something that has to happen. So when you say China, it's just easier for them to say, "Oh, don't worry, we're on it. Our emissions are only going to rise for another 9 years, and thereafter we'll do that." And that just helps things, helps them deal with the day-to-day, whatever their master plan is. That helps them with the day-to-day realities of getting along with the rest of the planet. But it is not just because any good salesman of anything will tell you what you want to hear. The question is should you believe it? And
right.
So I do think that putting less goop in the air, no matter what it is a good idea. I think the conclusion I came to in my book was if Alberta, using our vast hydrocarbon knowledge and advanced ingenuity and scientific principles, if we could come up with a method to, or the rest of the world, that'd be useful. No harm done. Get the particulate out of the air. There's real problems, not necessarily with carbon dioxide. I mean, I still think that may be oversold as the main cause of bad weather and climate change, but certainly particulate in the air of any kind, goop in the air, is bad for everybody. Bad for the climate, bad for your lungs. So there's a great case to be made to help them, but it's not by us going out of the fossil fuel business, Tammy. It's by us going into the fossil fuel. I would say advanced fossil fuels are the greatest single contribution that Canada could make, certainly Alberta. Whether we'll get the opportunity to do that against the political headwinds or not, I don't know.
Right, and that sort of ties into the idea of innovation, because it's like you said in your book that never before in the world have we been better equipped to solve this problem today, but is to eliminate fossil fuels. When it's like, but if we use the fossil fuels, we can help solve these problems better. And I think of, I think it was just the other day, the Trudeau government designated plastic as a toxic substance. So what do you make of this move? What are the implications for innovation? If, what happens to graphene and carbon fibers or carbon nanotubes? If hydrocarbons must be left in the ground and plastic is toxic and all these other things, right?
Yeah, people have no idea where anything comes from. I mean, there's several elements to this. One of another great book I read while I was trying to understand what was going on was Enlightenment Now by Steven Pinker. Yeah, and he had a section on climate change. And he said the problem, the challenge with virtual signaling is like I'm going to ban plastic or I'm going to unplug my cell phone charger at night and recycle my garbage. The problem with virtue signaling is it allows you to take your mind off the scale of the enormity. Decarbonize the world is so big. 7.8 billion people in the world waking up every day and making their own decisions on what they're going to do next. It appears to be impossible for most people to grasp. And so we tend to sell virtue signaling, and this goes back to that you're going to be okay feedback loop. And so this is just pure politics. I said that earlier, that it's something that people need. They have this one part of their cerebral cortex makes them react to fear, and the other makes them seek comforting solutions. And that's really all banning plastics is a comforting solution. Or what's happened in Canada, for example, is that the people that don't produce hydrocarbons, let's say British Columbia or in any scale or Central Canada, I say, well, I know what we'll do. We'll just take this out of Alberta by blocking the pipelines and forcing them to shut down the oil sands. and that is another version of this. Is here's a way that we can solve the problem that doesn't affect me politically. There's a subplot there, but
Yeah.
it's regrettably shallow to say these things. It's pure vote hunting. It's terrible.
So
It's
I
sort of
think
sugarcoat it like that, Tammy.
that's okay. That's okay. But another thing that you said in your book was that technology is driven by free market forces and it's a powerful tool. And given the right incentives, change will happen faster and sooner than anyone can imagine today. And I think that's a really important point because, like people of the 1970s and traditional newspapers, they didn't conceive of smartphones and social media being in existence now. So imagine if that technological innovation was directed and mandated by government. We probably wouldn't have a lot of things that we have today. And I think of a more recent example of SpaceX, where here's a private company who would have thought that reusable rockets would be possible at a fraction of a cost of other systems. NASA's had plenty of time to develop reusable boosters and whatnot, but never really did so. It took a private company to do it. So when we talk about innovation, there's the potential there to solve problems. But what you just explained sort of is that the governments are in there trying to direct where this innovation ought to be, rather than just letting the innovation happen.
There's no one less qualified than the government. I think if you look at the pandemic, and in Canada, we're grappling with the pandemic with the public healthcare system. I think we're all pretty happy that the vaccines are not publicly owned right now. That was that there was all the global drug makers. The prize was huge. The imperative significant, and so an amazing thing happened. Some of the world's biggest drug companies went out, gave us we have enough competition. So I think I want this one, or I don't like that one. Whereas if you do get COVID, the part of certainly in Canada anyway, the part of the treatment of it is all publicly owned, and the rivets are popping. So the idea that we're going to take the retooling of the global energy complex. This is I described it at the beginning of the book. The best number I could find is it's about $7 trillion US a year is what it costs to keep the lights on. And so all change the behavior of 7.8 billion people is some enlightened public policy and a mandate. So the people that claiming they can do this, and the people that we should think can do this, and this is the point I make in detail, is that are the least qualified people to do this on God's green earth. And we talked about that a little earlier about who runs for public office. How do you solve a 30-year problem on a 4-year election cycle? And they can't. It's impossible. I mean, it's one perpetual campaign from the day you win. And so the point is what we should do is the problem, and it is a problem. I'm not here to argue about the merits of and I concede that in the book. If we put enough goop in the atmosphere, will the weather change? Will we change the behavior of the weather? Possibly. Yeah, we've done it before. We certainly mucked things up with excessive pollution and things like acid rain back in the day. We've identified these problems and dealt with them and made the air cleaner. Certainly, burning dirty fossil fuels is bad for the air, whether it's affecting the weather or not. It's certainly affecting human health. So I'm all there for that. The question is who's most likely to solve this problem? Central planning by the perfectly ordinary people that were elected to public office, or should we turn it over to the experts? And this is one of the points I try to make about Alberta and its hydrocarbon resource industry. If you really want to come up with lower emission applications of fossil fuels, the people to do it are the same people they're trying to put out of business. It's absolutely counterintuitive how this is going to work. So what we should be doing is, with the youth of Canada today, instead of scaring the heck out of them, about how they have no future, what we should do is challenge them, saying, well, if it's your world, you're taking it over. Instead of fleeing from the world, why don't you roll up your sleeves, discuss candidly the challenge, the enormity of the problem, embrace technology as the solution. It is the only solution, and get on with fixing it instead of hiding from it. We're doing this completely backwards. But one of the slides I have in my slide deck, and I adjust. I have a presentation on the future of fossil fuels, and I adjust the content to the audience, trying not to be excessively insensitive. But I think in that great movie, A Few Brave Men, there's Colonel Jessup, played by Jack Nicholson, and the smart lawyer, played by Tom Cruise, and he's interrogating on the stand. And finally, Nicholson says, "You want the truth? You can't handle the truth." And so we should start with the truth. And the truth would be that instead of saying that China promises to do better, we should talk about where the emissions are coming from. This is where the emissions are coming from. I have this slide deck, a slide that I show audiences about sources of global emissions since 1988. I have this line at 1988 when climate change became global warming. Later, climate change became this issue in the Senate hearings in New York in 1988. And then I look at what has happened to emissions. And all the emissions, the incredible growth in emissions, are coming from the people we don't want to acknowledge, and the 41% that had nothing to do with Biden's revisited Paris commitments on Earth Day. Well, we should talk about that. You should understand that, and you say, instead, if you're really worried about the climate, instead of starving out your fellow Canadians or shutting down this valuable industry, or instead of reinforcing Canada as one of the world's most responsible suppliers of hydrocarbon energy, because they're going to buy it anyway, what they really need in China is some new technology. Why don't so you have to start with one of the challenges or the tragedies of the entire climate debate is the absence of an agreed upon basic set of facts.
Yes.
On what is going on in the world. So the truth, we can start with the truth. Here's what's going on in the world. Here's who is still building coal-fired electricity generating plants. Here's why they're doing it, because there's 6.5 billion people that want a piece of the good life that the OECD countries seem to be systematically destroying. And why don't we give them what they need? Why don't we, screw up our collective imaginations and technology? But we do have to start with an acknowledgement of what is really going on in the world, and the people in government don't seem to want to do that. The people that have, we've got a lot of climate sensitive leaders now with Biden in the White House and Trudeau in Ottawa. And the EU is going that way. Boris Johnson, I don't know what you put. You're in the UK. What did they spike his morning tea with? And what's he doing? He's I thought he was a very level-headed guy when he was mayor of London. And they have the narrative that got them in, and they've got their voter base that they're taking care of. So they don't want to have that conversation. So I guess it's up to you and I, platforms like this, and common sense to say, well, what is the state of the world climate? And say, instead of just trying to say, well, don't worry, China said that in 2030 they may or may not quit increasing emissions, and then in the next 30 years thereafter they claim they're going to reduce them. Why don't we acknowledge what do they need tomorrow to get with the program? Well, they need technology. Well, where's that going to come from? Well, it's not going to come from the federal or provincial department of really bright ideas run by professional bureaucrats. It's going to come from the innovators in the private sector, scientists and engineers, and that's what we have to. That's the discussion we have to have.
That's a really good point, and especially talking about having an honest discussion with agreeable facts and sort of truth on the ground. And I think of what they're talking about with respect to a net zero transition. Do people understand what that means? Because my sense is that there's at least two different meanings out there. There's the sort of presentation that the net zero will be allowing only the amount of emissions that are canceled out by carbon sinks, carbon capture, or extracting carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And it's sold as this kind of gradual phasing out of hydrocarbons and replacing with renewables, so that people are told they'll still have a similar energy consumption, maybe a little bit slightly reduced. They'll still have a car, but it'll be electric. But then there's another pathway, and I see this a lot in the academic literature, that they're talking about human activity, meaning zero use of any hydrocarbons or anything that produces emissions. And they talk about it as being significant degrowth. So the first pathway seems to be what they market to the public and financial institutions and corporations. But the second pathway is what has actually been agreed upon in Paris and what Canada says they're going to do for net zero. So do you see it that way, or what do you see as the sort of implications of a net zero transition in Canada, and what do people believe about it?
What I see is a quarter century of a crescendo of aspirational thoughts, theories, and propaganda that has not been challenged. And it took a long time to go from as you said in your introduction, that the miracle that's brought more health, prosperity, and opportunity to more people in the world is now going to be the end of this. It took a long time to create that narrative and get it taught in grade schools. In the book, I digress a little bit because I'm getting up to that, but I just want to say where it came from. My wife is a retired principal in the Calgary Board of Education, and Al Gore's movie got both an Oscar and a Nobel Prize.
Yeah.
And she would catch the teachers in her school slipping an inconvenient truth into the DVD player and calling it a lesson.
Right.
It wasn't in the curriculum. So anyway, it took a long time to get into this idea. So net zero by 2050 is one of those dangerous catchwords. It's a long time off, where people think, well, that's a good idea, and even corporations are saying it. But I think some of the corporate disclosure is probably more helpful. Equinor, the old Statoil, the uber green Norwegian state oil company, they said in their public disclosure, of course they're publicly traded, so they sort of have to get a little closer to the truth than those in public office. And they said that the net zero by 2050 challenge will allow us to embrace the opportunity to create new technologies. They have no idea, is what they're saying. What they said was, we actually don't. We're sure looking forward to figuring out how, is what they said. And so there is, I think what we're seeing with the net zero by 2050 is we're seeing a bit of, I call it the pre-COVID playbook that has a quarter century of momentum coming head to head with the post-COVID world. And so the real legs, the real growth in the climate change frenzy, or the idea of climate emergency being passed in city councils and even in our own House of Commons in Canada, is since the recession of 2008, 2009, Western countries have put a lot of quantitative easing, a lot of public debt and low interest rates. Percentage of the debt in 2009 recession was 55%, and going into the COVID crisis, it was up to 90, and now it's at 110. And so a lot of the energy transition that's been sold, and a lot of the advancements in renewables have been funded by cheap money. It's been subsidized by the government, and that's coming to an end. There's going to be tremendous competition for capital because of all the liquidity that central banks all over the world, trillions of dollars, have had to pump into the economy to keep the lights on during the lockdown. So the climate, the energy transition, which has been supported by government, is going to get a lot of competition with material needs like food, clothing, and shelter. We're seeing inflation in the most basic commodities like food. So how's it going to happen? It's not going to happen, Tammy, in my view. There's been a lot of it is aspirational. It is aspirational policy disguised, hiding behind the rhetoric of fear. When the rubber hits the road, I do not believe it's going to unfold. There's some great work done by a fellow from the UK called Tim Watkins, who writes. He has a blog site called The Consciousness of Sheep, and he writes about the energy cost of energy, and that is how much energy does it take to produce the next source of energy. And so I use the example of Middle East oil. The cost to unlock a huge oil field like the Ghawar field in Saudi Arabia, a little hole in the ground that cost $300,000 back in the day, or $200,000 a century ago, yielded a billion barrels of oil. Astonishingly cheap energy. Is enormous. They want us to go to wind and solar, but the energy input cost of that energy is huge, in the sense that there's the mining of the precious metals for the generators in the wind farms and the composition of the solar panels, and the fact it's interruptible, so you need more of these precious metals. So the energy cost of energy is planning to go through the roof. So when somebody says that we'll be able to replace this energy, we'll be able to replace reliable, low-cost energy, high power, low-cost energy in the form of coal, oil, or natural gas, with this other energy, not factoring in the energy costs of the future energy, this dog won't hunt, as we used to say on the oil rigs. And so this will, over time, I think we're seeing more material come out all the time on just how much lithium and cobalt and all the iron and steel, and what the carbon cost of the carbon input of a wind turbine by the time you put the cement and the steel in, and on and on and on. I think you're finding that the penetration of renewables into the modern market has only gotten as far as it has. I think the last figures I saw was $4 trillion for 2% of the world's energy. It is way too much. We can't afford this. And as soon as people have to start paying for it, you'll find that the enthusiasm for the energy transition at the ballot box will fade with it.
Well, I'm wondering, though, what role like Mark Carney and the Task Force for Climate Financial Disclosures and the NGFS, the Network for Greening the Financial System, will play in this, because it may be that people won't have a choice. If everything that you do, you have to account for all your emissions, I don't know. I think that's very problematic for how people will live and how expensive things will get, because it not only adds a layer of bureaucracy and red tape for companies to have to report on everything. Mark Carney says everything that gets measured gets managed. Well, I guess we'll all be managed because we'll all be measured, because they want to bring this into your mortgage, if you have a car loan, or anything related to financial services. And right now it's corporations, but they're planning on rolling this out to the general population. So if that's the case, and then you're kind of compelled to say, well, the heating of my house, I can't get a proper mortgage because I use natural gas, and I have to. I'm not really sure how people are going to be able to fight back. They may not have a choice. What do you think about that?
The question is will this carry the day at the ballot box? The politicians that have been leading the energy transition are there. The people we put into public office are there because they're a quarter century of fear. We talked about fear, have caused people to think that, vote for me and I'll take care of this for you. And they've been doing it. This is why I spent the time to talk about the cheap cost of money, the quantitative easing. Was the energy transition, as it's come so far, has been disguised. It's baked into your debt. I read a great article by Deutsche Bank on just to find an example of what you just spoke about. There was a great article by Deutsche Bank on the unlikelihood of anyone in Germany being able to again own a detached dwelling for all the reasons we talked about, right? Because of the
Yeah.
high heating costs and the insulation costs. This is at the same time that Bill McKibben is telling us you should grow groceries in your backyard. So you
Right.
should, the back to the land movement. Well, the trouble is there's going to
Yes.
be no land, right?
Right.
So it's utterly hypocritical. Uh, what there is, one of the phenomena of uber low interest rates or quantitative easing is an enormous amount of capital looking for a yield. And where do I get this was the irrational exuberance that Greenspan talked about going into the 2008 financial crisis was mortgage rates. And this was, they claim, was one of the reasons the shale boom in the United States kept going, even though nobody made any money. And so there's a tremendous amount of capital looking for a yield higher than 1 point. And so if governments can bring in, as they promised to do, bring in the construction of renewables with a guaranteed rate of return, there's an enormous amount of money available for this. The problem is the question is, will people be able to pay for it? Is this affordable at the voter level, or can I push this on you? So what has come up parallel with the Great Reset or the resilient recovery has modern monetary theory. A modern monetary
Right.
theory is debt doesn't matter. So the parallel to what you talked about, this infinite carbon reduction using every tool in the toolbox. What has also come up with modern monetary theory is there'll be infinite amounts of money available to central banks and governments to pay for this.
Right.
And that's where I believe the whole thing, well, as I said, this dog won't hunt. This is where I think the whole thing falls apart. Is that we're seeing inflation. They took 6 years off in oil development. All of a sudden, the world's recovering. They're seeing shortage of oil. Copper's going through the roof. Lithium's going through the roof. These are real. Food is the price of food is going up, basically caused by transportation costs and supply interruptions. And then on top of this, Canada, they've said, well, what we're going to do is we're going to raise carbon taxes by 170%. In the meantime, Canada's central bank, which was buying $4 billion worth of federal debt a week, has indicated, well, we're not sure we can do this any longer. So there are way more powerful forces at play in the global financial markets than the musings of Mark Carney and Michael Bloomberg and the task force on climate disclosure. There's massive macroeconomic forces that are well beyond the control of what we're reading and the people that are espousing this. So if you believe the foregoing, that we must do this, and that central banks can disguise the cost in forever, then away you go. You do all the stuff we talked about. Yeah, that your house will be, I've read all that stuff. Your house will become properly insulated. Houses won't become worth anything anymore, and on and on and on. But there's going to be some elections held during this period. And as people get more restricted in there, as the generation that's supported all this certainly has to pay for it. My theory is that the chickens will come home to roost, and there will be a regrettable, painful, unnecessary, but inevitable dose of reality coming to the whole thing, I think.
I hope so. I think part of the problem is that there's lots of experts out there informing policymakers and decision makers, but not so many engineers who, would have to be throwing cold water on this. I think of, for example, there was a study commissioned by the Dutch government a few years ago asking, okay, we want to go full net zero. Tell me, engineers, what do we need to do to make this happen? And the engineers came back and said, well, actually, It's going to be really, really hard. In fact, probably impossible.
Yeah,
And,
you know.
you know, and we're going to need so much of these minerals and materials, basically the entire global production of lithium, dysprosium, all of those things. We're going to need it all just for Holland. So too bad the rest of the world. And then we have the International Energy Agency this month produced their report on minerals and saying, there's going to need to be a massive increase in not just mining what's there, but exploring and finding new stuff to mine. And it's going to have to ratchet up like several 100% because if all of these countries go with electric vehicles and renewable energy and all this, the amount of materials required and the amount of built environment that's required is incredible. It's unfathomable how big it is, how much it is, which is brings me to this point about contradictions because the movement that's pushing for net zero, that's pushing for all of these things and keeping it in the ground is filled with contradictions. On the one hand, they say we need to be more self-sufficient, we need to do all this other stuff, that you can have your car, it'll just be electric, but we want to minimize your footprint so we have a circular economy. But these renewables use up so much space and they use up so many materials and they can't be recycled. So it's like, and it kills wildlife. And you have to wonder, what
Well,
I thought we were supposed to
yeah.
be protecting life, and they're talking about biodiversity, but the windmills just shred large birds that don't have very big nests, and it decimates bats. It does various other things, and there was a German study where they talked about how we're trying to figure out why the speed of the windmills or why the productivity drops so quickly and doesn't really recover. So they went out to the wind farm and they looked at the blades and they were covered in bugs, dead bugs. And it was the built up layers of dead insects that was slowing down the efficiency. So these engineers reported to the government and said, I think the wind farms might be responsible or play a really big factor in the insect apocalypse we've seen in Europe. That it's not farming because the European governments blame farmers and their use of pesticides and herbicides and whatnot. And these engineers said, actually, we've calculated the amount of bug residue on the windmills, and we think actually the windmills are mostly responsible. No one ever heard of this study.
I hadn't seen that one. Look. The point is, all this information is out there. Should you decide to look for it? Going
That's the
back,
thing, though. How do you get people to want to
well,
look for it, to not
well,
just believe
yeah,
what we're
well,
told?
one of the interesting things. Well, first of all, just before we leave the energy transition, the dislodging the 7 billion a year, trillion a year in fossil fuel based. There's not really an opportunity for new capital to go to work in this. Most of the major producers run on cash flow. Certainly, all the sovereign countries, the Saudi Arabias of the world, and even Pemex in Mexico, they actually make a lot of money producing oil. They don't compete with banks or capital investors. They compete with their own government. I mean, Saudi Aramco is fabulously. It's just a question of what the government can siphon off. Most of the multinational oil producers run on cash flow. They don't need capital.
Right.
So the idea there's going to be this incredibly massive transformation in the global energy markets is an opportunity to put a ton of money to work. I mean, it looks really compelling. Look at all in the era of uber low interest rates. So if you can figure out how to pay for this, which I say you can't, you can understand why capital markets, the idea that you could be an investment banker or a banker and you could make a boatload of money while wrapping yourself in the shrouds of moral probity at the same time. I mean, what a great day at the office. Eh? I could save the world and make a boatload of money at the same time, except you won't be able to. Now, going back to the facts, one of the most interesting presentations I saw was a pollster trying to explain to the oil guys in Calgary in 2013 about how to reach the millennials. That hand phone Is this thought that how do we reach the millennials? How do we reach the next generation? They don't read anything. Well, in fact, the amount of time they read is phenomenal. The amount of time people look at information on their handheld device. In the old days of printed newspaper or 3 channels in black and white with the 6 news. No, but I mean, it's incredible how much they read. The point is the software is all designed to be a feedback loop. You see what you want to see. And so they don't want to read that after a quarter century of being told that the climate change and fossil fuels are going to destroy civilization. They don't want to read that the alternative is the cure is as bad as the disease, which is the point I made in the book was everything you've said is correct, that the cure is as bad or worse than the disease. So what is going to cause people to change the channel? Investigate whether or not this will work or not. And it's going to have to be economic. You said it sounds good. It sounds bad. It's terrible that people have to suffer so much that we have to, at least in the West anyway, they're not going to bother doing this. In most of the developing world, they're going to soldier on and do what they're going to do.
Absolutely.
And maybe this was the transfer of wealth going back to 1972 with the first UN Environment Conference in Stockholm. I believe it was Indira Gandhi that went to that conference and talked about environment. Climate wasn't an issue at that time, but the environment certainly was. And she said, "Well, you guys have wrecked the whole world while we're trying to modernize." So maybe there. I don't think people are that clever that there's a giant subplot that this will be the transfer of wealth from the West to the rest of the world. Is they'll do what they want and will economically self-immolate. But I do believe that a little unhappiness, a little bit of pain, will cause people to investigate why is it that my disposable income is disappearing. Going back to Tim Watkins and this consciousness of sheep, he was the first person that I read that what the EU have done, the UK and the Western world has done, is we have really outsourced our emissions to Asia,
right,
in the pursuit of climate change. So we've shut down the heavy industry, the heavy manufacturing. It's all gone. Steel manufacturing, it's all gone to the other side of the world. We're not living without these things. We're just not doing them here. And so due to this growth in Asia and so on, of course, they've had to add quite a bit of energy at an affordable rate, which has been a lot of coal. And so I hadn't heard the insect phenomena, certainly knew about the unreliability of wind, certainly knew about the bird element of it. But yeah, these are a lot more intrusive. It's interesting about wind is the reason I've had to put them offshore is nobody wants them anywhere near their homes. The NIMBY process also not only applies to pipelines and refineries, it also applies to wind farms and solar farms. So
right. I mean, I lived in Germany for 6 years and in the middle of the energy transition there, and you drive around the countryside and it's just windmills everywhere, and the cost of our electricity was so expensive. It was, I think the cost of our utility outrageous. But I mean, Ontario went through the same thing, and yet they kept voting in win until finally they voted in Ford. And I'm not sure things have improved that much, but I want to present this bit of a hypothetical. So let's say that things go forward and there's incredible innovation where emissions can be captured at the source of production, oil sands plants, pipelines, power stations. This companies' emissions would be zero, and perhaps you wouldn't need to have a carbon tax. And if the technology to extract carbon dioxide directly from the air and stored or converted to rock is scalable, such that consumer emissions would be negated, do you think this would mean that the entire supply chain and consumer activity of emissions would be zero? With all that, do you think NGOs and politicians would let people just continue to live their lives in the lifestyle they enjoy? Would they drop the carbon taxes?
There's a subplot going on with climate. And I read when I was researching the book, I read the Green New Deal out of the States and the one that came out of Canada.
Yeah.
And I read Naomi Klein's book. Apparently, my friends have called me heroes for reading Naomi Klein. This changes everything: climate and versus capitalism versus climate, and capitalism versus climate. And there's a subplot going on with climate as a front end for something else, and it is utterly impractical. I mean, the idea that we're going to bring in massive, rapid transit, and there's going to be great jobs created and recycle wealth by insulating houses, and so they're going to stop international trade. I mean, there are elements of the climate movement that are actually it's socialism and government control of everything.
Right.
And that is it is interesting that it used to be socialism was the fundamental of social justice, and now they've managed to link this with self-preservation. It's the complete opposite of the fossil fuel movement we talked about earlier, where investment bankers could make a boatload of money and save the world at the same time. And this is the uber left has found a way that we could save the world and get the government we want would be running it.
Right. Yeah.
It really, I think with the ballot box, I'm hoping that as long as we continue to have open and fair elections, that the elements of it that you're talking about, I mean, you're talking about you're talking about the Jetsons, really, this idyllic world of the future, like the old cartoon show, where everybody zips around and life is everybody wealthy and prosperous using fantastic new technologies and inventions. That will not satisfy certain elements of the climate change movement. That's not what they want. That's not their end game. The weather and the climate is a means to another end. And we really have to sort through that. I think that's going to require, as many of the old sayings go, is a politician's greatest enemy is an informed voter. And so the question is, how are we going to inform the voters? Well, okay, I guess if we get enough economic unhappiness, the voters will inform themselves.
I hope so, because, I think of, if you're truly serious about this, then these environmental groups should be supporting nuclear energy. And
they want they come on, they should support coal. I mean, we were trying to export LNG off the west coast of Canada.
Yeah.
Canadian LNG has got incredible built-in advantages. The resource base is massive in the Montney in northeast BC, the dry gas up in the Horn River. The proximity to Asia is the best outside of Alaska.
Right.
The weather, actually, if you can imagine, is an asset for making LNG. The energy, one of the greatest energy inputs of creating LNG is cooling the gas to liquefy it. And so the ambient temperature, imagine we finally found something useful to do with Canada's awful weather. The ambient temperature change from Kitimat on an annual basis compared to Qatar or Australia is we can liquefy natural gas with way less energy input. So you've got all the advantages, and yet the climate movement is opposed to fracking. I mean, it's approved the greatest reduction in emissions in the world has taken place in the United States primarily by using shale gas, hydraulic fracturing to replace coal for electricity generation. And the Greens want to shut down natural gas and fracking. You just have to stop and say, no, wait a second here. If you had all the information in front of you, would you not want nuclear power? Well, the only reason you would not want nuclear power is actually you want a world with no power.
Right.
And that's why I read Bill McKibben. Bill McKibben's book. The one book I read was Earth with two E's. Yeah. And I read one of his books, and he lives in Ripton, Vermont, population of 792. And he was the great proponent of this back to the land theory, where the Chinese, you would fertilize the fields with your own excrement, and you would get rid of this. And then what I did was I got the populations of the 10 largest cities in the world outside of the United States, and they had the same population as the United States. And I just wondered, movement transferable to the
Right.
280 million people that lived in just 10 cities. And this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, that we're going to get rid of the single family dwelling when everybody else tells you should grow your own food in the backyard. This is one of the many absolutely absurd contrasts underlying the climate emergency that just deserve to see the light of day. And it goes back to the reason I wrote my book. Look, if you know all this stuff and you want to do it anyway, well, you're an informed voter. Bring it on. But they don't know this. They're not informed. And how do we get them informed? And again, that goes back to economic misery, I guess.
Right. And what I think is interesting is how the NGOs are represented in the media or in public perception, that they're these noble people who just want to take care of the earth and everything. And, if that were true, then why did they sign a letter to the Biden administration asking that carbon capture, utilization, and storage and nuclear be removed from the climate plan?
It
So
is, it is. This goes back the demonization of again, the best thing I've read, and I don't know if you read it or not, is Why We Invite the Invisible Hand by Peter Foster.
yes,
But the demonization of business, free enterprise, and the market-based economy as just another narrow interest group, that took even longer than 25 years. That took a half century from the
yeah,
birth of the progressive movement. And the idea that a group of NGOs, or there was on the Line 5 debate, there was the chambers of commerce from everywhere along the pipeline affected. The chambers of commerce in Michigan and Ontario and Quebec and everybody along the line all stepped up and said, we can't shut this pipeline down. The chambers of commerce, of course, is all the small businessmen. How many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people did these people represent directly and indirectly? But the news report said, but environmentalists and some indigenous and some First Nations are opposed. And there was no balance there. There's a small group of unknown people wrapped in the cloak of environmental altruism versus common sense in the economy at large. It is one of the flaws in the increasingly eviscerated modern media of there's not much left there anymore. They just say, well, I need two sides to the story. And fortunately, even when common sense is on the one side, the media is all rigged up to give the voices, however small, as long as there's another side to the story, they'll print it. It's too bad, but that's the way it works.
yeah. Well, I think we should end it on that note with line 5.
I mean, no, what the sadness of how the modern media works. That's where we're ending it. Yeah. Well, line
Yeah.
5 again. I was asked. The day, when will they shut the pipeline down? Never. I mean, it's just too crazy. I was researching the treaty, the 1997 Pipeline Transit Treaty. I was reminded yesterday. I had a wonderful conversation with the former CEO of TransCanada, Hal Quisley, really thoughtful guy, but we happened to be talking, and he reminded me that treaty exists at the request of the United States. During the oil shortage of the 1970s, they wanted to make sure that they could get their oil from Alaska to the lower 48. They asked for that treaty to make sure that they could put the oil eventually went by tanker from Valdez through the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, but they wanted the Alaska natural gas pipeline for a long time. So I'm hoping that in the end, international treaties will replace the evaporation of common sense in the public debate. But since you're talking about Line 5 and why the courts intervened and where this is all going, everybody knows. They've heard a little bit about this obscure treaty from 1977. I was just reminded yesterday of where it came from, and I thought that might be useful. Since you wanted to close on that, there's a little nugget for you, a little factoid from history.
Yeah, that's a good one. I remember when Canada announced in the 70s and in 1974 that they were going to be phasing out oil exports to the United States. And
Yeah.
that was another motivator to try and prevent, like, especially with the free trade agreement and the energy chapter in it that Canada signed with the United States back in
Yeah. Yeah. The port
1988,
88.
so
The
it was
proportionality clause. Yeah.
right. And so
Yeah.
it was to
Yeah.
prevent Canada from doing that again. Oh,
Yeah.
we're going to phase this out now. So it's interesting now for climate change. These treaties are
They're still.
there
Yeah.
and supposedly to protect consumers, to protect the public. And so I'm thinking, if let's say that they do actually shut it down, would you see Atlantic offshore oil heading to Sarnia?
They could resuscitate the tanker fleet down the St. Lawrence again. They used to barge oil. The original pipeline went from Edmonton to Superior, Wisconsin, when Imperial Oil had the refining operation in Sarnia. The original pipeline post Leduc went from Edmonton to Superior. At that point, they used to barge the oil down the Great Lakes to Sarnia from Edmonton, and then in 1953 they said, "Well, no, this is too seasonal because they liked having a reliable source of Canadian oil. Imperial or ExxonMobil liked being on both ends of that trade, producing the oil in Alberta and refining in Sarnia. So they were the driver of Interprovincial Pipeline to put the original Line 5 in. And so the idea that you would shut down Line 5 to protect the Great Lakes and replace it with tanker traffic on the Great Lakes,
Right.
which from either direction. Okay, this is one of the great. This has been a great lively discussion because you're very good at extracting some of the absolutely hypocritical, diametrically opposed views on the solution in our discussion. And there's another one. It's the
Yeah.
same thing we struggle with here. Is they've banned tankers on the West Coast through Bill C-49 allegedly to save the environment. Well, meanwhile, we've not said boo about the tanker traffic from Valdez, Alaska to Washington State. The tankers, you can see, they drive by Victoria every day and have for decades. And so,
Yes.
and then we've got tanker traffic bringing oil down the St. Lawrence River from international bad guys, producers, to refineries in Ontario or in Quebec. I'm sorry.
In Quebec, yeah.
And now they want to go further down through the rest of the Great Lakes. Doesn't anybody know anything about anything? I mean, help me. Where is this in any way? Where is in any way climate justice or even climate sense? None of it makes any sense. And
Right, but see, then they would the hydrocarbons altogether. And so,
and again, as long as
yeah.
as long as 7.8 billion people in the world will wake up again tomorrow, those that are sleeping now will, and they will make, unless they're not allowed to by governments, they will make the most logical purchasing decisions they can to get through the day at the lowest possible cost. That is the force that we're dealing with here. And that force is unbelievably powerful, as witnessed by the 6.5 billion people that don't live in OECD countries. That's what's going to decide what the future of incumbent fossil fuels, not Mark Carney or the EU. The people drive is the most important. I don't think we talked about this earlier. I don't think they conceive the power of 7.8 billion consumers. There's not enough money to force people to do this. The consequences of denying people food. I mean, we've talked. You've seen my material on how 1/3 of the fertilizer in the world is made from natural gas. 3 billion people depend on fossil fuels for food. This won't work.
Yes.
It is. It's frustrating. It's confusing. It's frightening from time to time. But in the end, we're this period of public policy going crazy with quantitative easing paying for it is over. With a post-COVID era is going to be a recalibration of everything that matters. And a lot of the stuff that we've been reading about, I do not believe will materialize.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to have a conversation with me about these issues and for talking about your book, Miracle to Menace. I highly recommend people go to Amazon or their local bookstore and see if they can find it, and definitely read it. It's an amazing book, and will really shed light on the historical context for all of these issues we've been discussing today, and for understanding how we got here. So thank you again, Mr. Yager. I hope you have a good day, and thank you for taking the time to speak with me.
It's my favorite subject. Thanks you very much for your thoughts and great questions.
Thank you.